I think so. Let's see. Okay, go ahead.
Welcome everybody to the April 21st Chesapeake Rotary Club meeting. It's a gorgeous day. I do appreciate everybody coming out here. Baxter Innes, if you could lead us in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day. Thank you for the absolutely beautiful spring day. Thank you for letting us come together here today. Pass your blessing on each and every member, both the ones that still here and those who can't be with us today. Bless this club and bless the things that we do to make the world a better place. Thank you for this fellowship. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Future President Jana McCaskey, if you could lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Bob Morcusen, could you please lead us in the four-way test? First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? All right, be seated, please. Chuck, everyone be seated except for you. If you could come on up here.
Welcome, everyone. Great to see everybody out. Once again, we are both Zooming and live streaming on Facebook. So we're doing everything we can to reach out. Yes, well, we have a prospective new member, Bobby Nance, and Bobby is with a tree expert service. In fact, it's called Bartlett Tree Experts. And I think he's already been tasked with various trees that we are having issues with among the group here. Welcome, Bobby.
Welcome, Bobby.
And we don't have anything to raffle today, so I was going to mention, folks, you might want to bring some raffle items in, some wine or gift cards or whatever you think folks might enjoy getting in a raffle. Okay, happy bucks. Any happy bucks out here? Anyone? Anyone? All right, well, that's it. Back to Jonathan.
Thank you, Chuck. And generally for our raffle items, it's people who are having birthdays in the month, which of course would be the month of April, or anniversaries. So anybody who falls into those categories, please bring some items for us to raffle away. Booze is always a good big hit, but any other things that anybody or you think other people might enjoy would be great. So without any further ado, if I could have Baxter Innes come up here and introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, President Jonathan. Well, let me tell you, folks, I am delighted today to welcome an old friend of mine, Craig Von Buseck, here to speak to us today. I got to tell you, I knew him from my days at Regent, and he was at both at CBN and Regent. We haven't really stayed that much in touch until recently. And I want to tell you why. I started seeing Craig's post on Facebook as he was traveling all over the place doing research on his book. Not one book, but two books at the same time. As a fledgling author, can I tell you, he inspired me. He has motivated me with his travels. I did a little checking on his website and some of his places. I counted 55 different places that Craig had visited, 55 battlefields, museums, national parks, historical sites. That's incredible. It tires me to think about it. 55 places. But let me tell you, for whether it's been on college campuses and classrooms, whether it's been in boardrooms, or whether it's been on TV or radio or on webcasts, Craig has been the public eye for 35 years. He's a much sought after speaker. He does, keynote speaks. He does conferences, and he's spoken all across the United States and across the world in some places. He is a multi-published author. He's got several of his books here today. He serves as the managing editor of inspiration.com or org down in Charlotte, and he is a contributing writer to a number of publications, CBN.com, MTL, Charisma Magazine, and I'm sure others there. His education, he holds a doctorate or whatever of ministry, and he holds an MA in religious journalism, both from Regent University. He has 2 new books. Look, most of us mortals just write one book at a time, right, Chuck? One at a time. This man was writing 2. He's got 2 of them. Well, you only brought the one. The other one comes out in May. Okay. 2 books simultaneously. That's incredibly hard to do, but he has done it. And I'm telling you right now, the other book that's not here, I've read it. His 2 new books, the one that he brought today is called Victor, The Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. And I don't know, you're going to learn about it today. It talks about the last 2 years of Grant's life that most people don't know about. It is an amazing story that we're going to hear about today. And his other book was called Forward, and that's the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant, which I read and highly recommend when it comes out. Craig also wrote another book. Is it up there? I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman, and the Rebirth of Israel. And he won a prestigious CELO Award with that in 2020. He's been nominated for the Truman Award by the Truman Presidential Library. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Craig von Buseck.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank Baxter because he didn't mention that he endorsed the book that I wrote about the leadership principles of Ulysses S. Grant. And so I was greatly honored by that. So thank you for having me. Now, when we think about Ulysses S. Grant, and I usually like to walk around, but I guess I need to stay here for the camera. So forgive me. Normally I'll get out there and talk with you and walk around. But when we think about Ulysses S. Grant, what are some of the things that we think of? Well, he was a butcher, and he was a drunkard, and he was a failed president, second worst president to Buchanan. These are the things that I was taught growing up. So are those things true? Well, the answer is he was not a drunkard, he was an alcoholic. And there's a big difference between those 2 terms. Drunkard would have been the 19th century version or way they would describe someone who was irresponsible, slothful, and had a drinking problem. We now know that it's a disease. However, he overcame that disease. And before he entered the White House, he totally started to abstain from alcohol and never drank other than maybe a courteous sip during functions where there were diplomats and that kind of thing. The question of was he a butcher? Well, there's a scholar named Edward Bonekemper who actually did analysis of the different generals and the casualty numbers for the generals. And some of you here in the South might not like to hear this, but Grant's casualty numbers were actually lower than Robert E. Lee's. And so those who would call Grant a butcher, when you put the numbers up side by side, it's hard to uphold that question. The other factor in that is that before the Overland campaign, Grant's casualty numbers were way, way low. They went shooting up during the Overland campaign when the greatest general of the South, Robert E. Lee, came up against the greatest general of the North, General Grant. And that's when it was really a terrible, terrible bloodletting on both sides. So then the question becomes, was he the worst president that we ever had next to Buchanan? And the answer is no. He was actually one of the great presidents that we've ever had. And he held together the Union at the time when we could have fallen into another civil war. And so there are all of these really what are historical myths about this man that when you actually look at the facts, you start to realize perhaps I've been taught wrong. And so that is one of the things that has been happening with Ulysses S. Grant by scholars and writers over the last 30 years, is there has been a re-examination of Grant based on historical research and based on analytics rather than based on just politics. And there's a big difference between writing from a political bent and writing from a historical bent scientifically. And so that is why you see several books that are redressing the question of who Ulysses S. Grant was. One of those people is an author named Ron Chernow. Now, some of you might know, if you don't know Ron Chernow, you might know what he has produced. He wrote a little book called Alexander Hamilton, which became the Broadway musical Hamilton, which some of you have seen and many of us have now seen online. Some of you may have seen actually on Broadway or in one of the traveling shows. And after he wrote the book Hamilton, he went on to write a book about the life of Ulysses S. Grant. Has anybody read the Chernow book on Grant? Well, if you are interested in Grant's entire life, that would be one of probably half a dozen that I would recommend on Grant. But that was picked up as I was working on my book. All of a sudden, this book was picked up by Leonardo DiCaprio, Ron Chernow's book. And I found out that they were going to make a movie of it. And I thought, oh, well, that's going to be some competition for me. But then I found out that no, it's not going to be a movie. It's actually going to be a documentary on the History Channel. Did anybody see last year the documentary on the History Channel? That was based on Ron Chernow's book about Grant. And the executive producer was none other than Leonardo DiCaprio, and Chernow was also an executive producer of that film. So there's been a re-examination of Grant. Now, I first became interested in the story that I tell because Chernow's book is Grant's entire life. And so he only has one chapter that deals with the last 2 years of his life. Whereas I wanted to do a book that dealt with the entire 2 years, one book on the last 2 years. So it's much more focused in what happened during those last 2 years. So you say, well, what did happen? Well, I first started to become interested in this around 1999. All of us were partying just like it was 1999, right? And during that time, I went out and bought a set of VHS tapes, right? 1999 VHS tapes of Ken Burns' series on the Civil War. And I got to this part at the end of that series that talks about what happened in the last 2 years of Grant's life. And I was shocked and amazed. Now you would say, well, what happened in the last 2 years of Grant's life? Well, that's what I want to tell you about. So Grant had been a two-term president. And when he left to run for president and he resigned from the military, he had been a four-star general, I believe the first four-star general in our nation's history. And he had been a lieutenant general before that, a rank that the last person who held that rank was George Washington. And they revived the rank after Grant's brilliant victories at Vicksburg, which, by the way, military colleges still teach the strategy of Vicksburg to this day. In fact, the person who did the foreword for my second book, for the foreword book, is a retired colonel from the Army who taught in the Army war colleges. And he said, we teach the strategy that Grant used in Vicksburg. So after that brilliant victory, and then after the victory at Chattanooga, the Congress said, we need to revive the rank of lieutenant general to recognize what Grant has done, but also to kind of, so it's a kind of a carrot but also to give him a stick to say, all right, finish the war, go down and fight against Lee. And so at first, Lincoln was opposed to it because he was afraid that he was creating a political rival. And this was 1863 in the fall, and the beginning of 1864. Well, we know what that is. That was an election year, and Grant didn't want to create his own opponent. So at first he's like, well, I don't know. I've had generals like Pope and like McClellan, who, by the way, ran against him for the Democratic on the Democratic ticket that year, and other generals like Hooker, who were full of themselves and who want to become president. I don't want to create another person like this. So he sent out Frank Blair. And if you ever saw the movie Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, the Blairs were a very influential party or family who helped start the Republican Party. And Frank Blair was actually a general, and he had been under Grant during Vicksburg. And so Lincoln sent Frank Blair out and said, go ask Grant what his intentions are. And so Frank Blair went out and, very in a politically correct way, was like, so what are you thinking, down the road? What are your aspirations? And Grant picked it up just like that. Grant is much more intelligent than a lot of people gave him credit for. He knew exactly what he was asking. And he said, if you're asking if I want to run for president against President Lincoln, that's the last thing I want to do. I want to see Lincoln stay as our president. And so Frank Blair went back and told Lincoln, and Lincoln said, I'm all for this lieutenant general rank. I think it's a great idea. And so they passed that law, and Ulysses S. Grant became lieutenant general, and then he moved up the ranks, became two-term president. But when he ran for president, he had to give up his pension for the Army. And they did not have a pension for the president of the United States until this guy, Harry S. Truman. Can you believe that? They didn't have a retirement pension for presidents until Harry S. Truman, probably because Harry S. Truman was I think he was the poorest of the presidents that we ever had. And so they wanted to take care of him. But Grant did not have such luck. And so when he left the White House, he needed to look for a job because he didn't have a pension. Well, fortunately for him, his son, Buck, was a very talented investments financier. And he had invested in the Comstock silver mine and made some money for Ulysses and Julia Grant. Well, it was a big chunk of money. You got to remember that Grant and his wife had been serving the country for the last 20 years without any let up at the highest level of responsibility. That becomes tiring after a while, and you are wanting to have a little bit of a break. So they had this big chunk of money, and they said, we want to tour the world. So he and Julia, for 2 years, they traveled all around the world. They met with Queen Victoria. They met with the Pope in Rome. They met with the Sultan in Constantinople or in Istanbul. And everywhere Grant went, he was mobbed by thousands of people all around the world, because this was, the last great war. Anything before that would have been the Napoleonic Wars. And there weren't any big wars going on, but it also had to do with freedom. And around the world, people were longing for freedom. They were longing to overthrow colonialism. They were longing to have equality. And so they saw Grant as a symbol of what the war meant in America. And so Grant toured all around, and President Hayes thought this was absolutely great, Rutherford B. Hayes, because Grant was a free diplomat, not on the public dole. So Hayes said, listen, I'll send Navy ships, and whenever you need transportation, we'll take you from one place to another. So these Navy ships followed Grant around the world for 2 years and gave him a ride wherever he wanted to go. And he actually negotiated a peace between Japan and China, who were warring over these disputed islands. First time an American president ever did something like that. Well, the money started to run low again. And so Grant said, well, what am I going to do now? And so they started heading back home, and his political handlers said, if you want to run again for a third term, you'd win. We guarantee you would win. Grant didn't want to run for a third term. He was not interested, but he needed a job. And so he said, well, if you think I could win, Julia would love to be first lady again, because she was like she was like a Dolly Madison type. She was just a party lady, very wonderful woman, Julia Grant, very impressed with her. So Grant was like, sure, I'll run again. Well, so he ran and he lost to Garfield, but it took like 35 ballots. And Grant always was in the lead until the very last ballot. And then finally there was a, people were like, you know what, we don't really want to break the 2-term limit, even though it wasn't ensconced yet in the Constitution. And they wouldn't vote for Grant, even though he was leading every ballot until that last ballot. So now, once again, he loses to Garfield, who goes on to be president. What am I going to do next? And so he's looking for work and he's looking for a home. They didn't have a place that they really wanted to be. And after being president for 8 years, you kind of get used to that kind of lifestyle, rubbing elbows with the elites. And so he didn't want to go back to Galena, Illinois, out in the Nowheresville, where he did have a house, but they didn't really want to live there. And so his son came to him and said, Dad, or father, back then they would say, Father, I have started an investment firm with someone who they call the young Napoleon of Wall Street. His name is Ferdinand Ward. And we would like for you to become a third partner with us in this investment firm. And Grant said, well, Ulysses said, I don't know anything about investments. And Buck said, oh, it's all right. We'll take care of that. Your job is to bring in the carriage train. All of your friends, all of your influential people that you met as general, as president in your world tour, bring those in. And also the soldiers, we'd love to have them invest as well. And so Ulysses said, will we make money? And Buck said, we're already making a ton of money, because they called Ferdinand Ward the young Napoleon of Wall Street. Everybody thought he was a genius. And so Grant said, well, okay. And so he invested quite a bit of money, $100,000 in the 1880s. That's a lot of money. And so he became one of the 4 partners, because there was another owner of a bank, of Marine Bank, who invested as well. And so this investment firm was called Grant and Ward. And everybody all of a sudden wanted to invest. You can imagine, former president of the United States, he's got all these contacts. This is going to be a firm that's going to make me money. So all these people started to invest in Grant and Ward. And after a year or so, Ferdinand Ward told Ulysses that he was worth more than $1 million in the 1880s. And so Grant thought, this is great. By the way, several of his friends had bought him a house because the Congress had not restored his pension. And people like Vanderbilt, JP Morgan, Carnegie, they all got together and said, this is a travesty that our country has not taken care of General Grant. Because in England, with Wellington and Waterloo, when he defeated Napoleon, they lavished millions of pounds on him. They gave him several country estates, and he was living almost like a king. And so when Julia and Ulysses went to England and saw this, they kind of looked at each other and said, maybe we fought for the wrong country, because they were not, they had nothing. They didn't even have a pension, no home, no nothing. It was like, thank you very much, General Grant. And, I hope you're well. And so all these people had given them a home and given them a pension. They had created a trust fund for them. But now he's with this investment firm and he thinks he's worth $1 million. The problem was that Ferdinand Ward was running a giant Ponzi scheme. He was the Bernie Madoff of the 1880s. And after a little more than 2 years, overnight, the house of cards collapsed. And now Ulysses S. Grant goes from thinking he's worth $1 million to being worth exactly $80. Now, he had this lovely house, but the problem was Ferdinand Ward had taken the trust fund and robbed it. So now Grant doesn't even have the trust fund anymore. And he's too embarrassed to go back to all these friends to say, hey, my money's all gone. He's totally, in fact, he and Buck were under investigation for quite a while because the government thought, well, they must have been involved. They knew nothing about it. The whole thing was done in secret. So now Grant loses everything. Buck loses everything. Fred Grant, Jesse Grant, the other 2 sons, all lose all their savings that they had plowed into this thing. All those soldiers lost their savings. All of those generals and aristocrats and leaders that had invested because of Grant all lost everything. And so now Grant is once again penniless and wondering, what am I going to do? But he's also terribly embarrassed that he had been duped. The savior of the Union, lieutenant general, two-term president, and duped by a shyster. So now what is he going to do? Well, he needs to find work to pay the bills, because Congress, there were several people in Congress that were pushing to get his military pension restored, but they were all like, hey, his fat cat friends have given him all this money. Why should we give him a pension on top of, so he can have more money? And then when the whole house of cards collapsed, they said, well, it was sad for him, but he's still got all of his rich friends. What they didn't know was that Grant and his wife had to let go of all of the servants. They had to shutter their home. They went off to their home on Long Branch because they couldn't afford to live in New York City. So they're out in Long Branch, New Jersey, trying to figure out what they're going to do next. And Grant was approached by a magazine. It would be like Life or The Atlantic or something like that, that did essays, called the Century Magazine, which was very popular at the time. And they wanted Grant to write his remembrances of some of the great battles. So Grant went to work on this just to bring in a little bit of money. I mean, talking a few $100s, but he still didn't know what he was going to do long term. So as he's working on the Battle of Shiloh, his wife gave him lunch out on their veranda there in Long Branch, and he bit into a peach, and he rose up from the table in terrible pain. He's like, I think an insect stung me from inside the peach. And he's like trying to clear his throat out with water. And that pain never subsided. Well, it subsided, but it never fully went away. It got a little bit worse, a little bit worse, a little bit worse every day. Finally, he waited 3 months, sadly, and he finally went to his doctor. His doctor had been traveling in Europe. And you need to remember the context. Garfield had just died not too long before this from the assassin's bullets, and a lot of people were blaming the doctors, which we now know is exactly correct, that it was the doctors that probably killed Garfield, not the bullet wounds, because they were going in there without cleaning their hands. They were probing all around inside the wound, and Garfield died of sepsis. So a lot of people distrusted doctors at this time, including U.S. Grant. So he only wanted to talk to his own doctor. Well, his doctor had been traveling in Europe. So when he finally got back later that fall, Grant went and met with him, and the doctor looked down his throat and said, you need to go to a throat specialist. And Grant knew this guy. He had been a doctor in the Army with the Sanitary Commission, and his name was Dr. John Hancock Douglas. So Grant went and he talked to the doctor, and Grant could see on his face that there was a problem. And so Grant said, before the doctor said anything, he said, is it cancer? And the question having been asked, the doctor had to give him an answer. Now, he gave a very technical term for it, but basically he said, yes, it's cancer, and it sometimes can be curable. Well, Grant had been asked by several people to write his memoirs before this, and he never wanted to. I'm worth $1 million. Why do I want to take my time to write my memoirs? Plus, he had been raised a good Methodist by his very humble mother, where you don't write about yourself, you know, and he saw a lot of these memoirs that were written by some of the Civil War generals as braggadocious, or they were hit pieces against other people, both of which he found distasteful. So he didn't want to write his memoirs. But now he knew he was dying. So he went directly, and before this, the Century Magazine people said, we also have a publishing arm, and we think that you should write your memoirs. So after leaving the doctor's office, he got in a public carriage, which would be like getting on a public bus. Two-term president, Savior Union, he got on a public bus because he couldn't afford anything else, and went across town to the Century offices, walked in and said, I'm ready to write my memoirs. Why would he do that? Because he knew he was dying, and he knew that he was penniless, and the only way that he could take care of his wife, Julia, who he loved, they had a lifelong love affair, and there are some scenes between them that are just delightful. And so he had in his heart this love for his wife, and also to help restore the fortunes of his sons and his children. And so he literally went directly to their offices and said, I'm ready to write my memoirs. Well, Mark Twain was his good friend. You've heard of Mark Twain, the author? Yeah. He was a good friend of Ulysses S. Grant. And a couple of years earlier, he had started his own publishing company, Charles Webster and Company, to publish his own books because he was tired of, anybody who's an author here knows that you get a little bit of the royalty and the publisher gets a lot of the royalty. And by this time, he was well known enough that he said, I'm going to start my own publishing company so I get that big amount. And his first book was, you might have heard of it, Huckleberry Finn, for his own publishing company. And so he had approached Grant 2 years earlier, trying to book him to write his memoirs. And Grant said, no, I'm not interested. So now he finds out that Century Company, which were his friends, might be, doing this book, but they had not signed the contract. So the next morning he runs over to Grant's house and he meets with them. They have, cigars. This was before the doctor told Grant he couldn't have a cigar anymore. And he said, so there's a rumor that you might be writing your memoirs. Is that true? And he said, yeah, I think I'm going to be doing it with the Century Company. And he said, oh, well, they're good friends of mine. I'm writing, I'm doing some excerpts of Huckleberry Finn in the magazine. Oh, wonderful. I've been writing stories in the magazine. Oh, wonderful. Mark Twain says to him, I know a little bit about publishing. Perhaps I could look at the contract just to make sure that everything is fair. So he hands over to the competition the contract, which has not been signed, but it was just a recommendation, a proposal. And Twain said, I didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. Ulysses S. Grant, in terms of business, was a veritable babe in the woods because he looked at this contract and they were only offering him 10% royalty, which is what a beginning writer would get, not a savior of the Union two-term president. And they were taking out of his 10% things like, sweeping charges and mail postage charges and all those kind of things. So even cutting it below 10%. And so Twain, Fred Grant, the oldest son of Ulysses, who was very close to him, had walked in by this time. And Twain said, you should take out 10% and make that 20%. And also this whole thing about sweeping floors, get rid of that. And Grant started to laugh and he said, I can't do that. These people, out of the goodness of their hearts, that's what he was thinking, have given me this contract. I can't do that. And Twain said, sir, for that attitude, you're going to get 2 halos in heaven. But that's not correct here on earth. He said, you need to do this. And Fred said, Mr. Twain, really, do you think that we could get 20%? And Twain said, not only do I think it, I could guarantee it. And Grant said, and Ulysses said, well, how can you guarantee that? He said, I'll have Frank Bliss from the American Publishing Company, who had published several of Twain's earlier books. I'll have him give you a bid by tomorrow morning. That's how sure Twain was of this. Now, Twain never intended to have Frank Bliss do this, but he wanted to let them know that this is what it's worth. And so they kept talking, and finally Grant said, well, I can't do that because the Century Company, they were the first ones to talk to me about that. Well, now Twain said, I got him, because he had talked to him 2 years earlier. And so he said, well, if that's the case, General Grant, then I get the book, because if you remember, I talked to you about doing your memoirs 2 years ago. And Fred said, Dad, Father, Father, he's right. I was in that meeting. He did ask you to write your memoirs. And Ulysses said, well, you got me. You did. So they brought in a lawyer from Philadelphia who was a friend of a friend to do investigating between the two companies. And now by this time, all the other publishing firms had heard about Grant wanting to write his memoirs. So he had 20 offers, but they were looking just at these 2. And in the end, every time the Century Company would match the deal that Twain made, Twain would up the deal. And so finally, in the end, Grant, not only because of the better deal, but because he trusted Twain. And he knew Twain would take care of him, which he very much did. Twain went above and beyond to take care of Ulysses S. Grant and his family during that time. And so Ulysses Grant started to write his memoirs using a yellow legal pad and a pencil. And every day that he could, as the cancer is progressing, until the point it got to be the size of 2 men's fists sticking out of the side of his neck. And there's a photograph in this book where you see him only days before he died in the great cottage on Mount McGregor, which is still a wonderful place that I highly recommend that you go and do their tour. And actually, the proprietor, the head of Grant Cottage, wrote the foreword for the Victor book. But every day, Grant was there writing his memoirs, and Fred and others were helping do research and editing. But Grant was charging away, and he had terrible pain from the cancer growing, but he wouldn't take morphine or any opiates because he didn't want to cloud his mind, because he wanted the memoirs to be right. This was a labor of love, not just for his wife, but also to combat the growing lost cause school of pro-Confederate writers, and to say, listen, you say the war was not about slavery, but Grant very much, especially in the last chapter of his memoirs, comes out and says, it must be admitted that this war was about slavery, and that it was one of the worst causes. He said, the people who fought this war were valiant, and they fought very bravely and heroically, but it was one of the worst causes that a war was ever fought for. And so he made that statement as one of his dying statements, but he also was there trying to take care of his wife and his family. He finished the book 4 days before he died on Mount McGregor. And his funeral was still the largest funeral in American history. 1.5 million people came out to New York City to watch. And you can go to the Grant Presidential Library, and they actually have photographs of this. It's down at Mississippi State University. And there are photographs of the funeral, and there are literally people who climbed up telephone poles and were holding on to the top of the telephone pole because that was the only place they could get a view. Other people were sitting on rooftops. Other people were looking out windows. Mark Twain had his offices in Union Square, and as the funeral cortege went by, he said, I think that writing the book kept him alive for as long as it did. And he said he was a very great man, and superlatively good was what Mark Twain said about him. So Twain then published the memoirs later that year in 1885. And in the end, the book made for Julia Grant a profit of $450,000, the second largest seller of the 19th century. In today's money, that would be $10 million plus. So in all of that, Grant triumphed. He restored his reputation because the country said, look at this man. What he was going through, most people would be lying in a bed under medication, and he fought every day for his wife. He fought every day for the truth. And so that's what this book is about. It's called Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. So thank you for having me, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Any questions? Yes. Yes. Actually, there was a massive restoration. The question for those watching at home later on, the question is, there had been a lot of decay at the U.S. Grant Memorial, which in common parlance is Grant's tomb in New York City, in Riverside Park. There was a lot of graffiti, and homeless people were, gathered around, and it had really fallen into a place of decay. And there was a massive push by different grant groups to say, we need to give honor to whom honor is due. And it's interesting because it really comes at the same time as these historians and writers have been re-examining Grant's reputation and his importance. And Baxter reminded me of a quote that was made at the beginning of the 20th century by a guy you might have heard of. He was vice president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt. And they asked him about Ulysses S. Grant, and he said, well, when you look at the greatest people in American history, the three greatest would have to be George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant. That's what Teddy Roosevelt thought of him at the time, while there were still people alive who remembered what really happened, and they remembered Grant's contribution. And so there has been this re-examination to recognize Grant's importance in American history, but also in the history of freedom in the world. And so there was a major push and a lot of pressure put on the National Park Service, and they did restore it, and I've been there, and it is absolutely lovely. I highly recommend. It is, I believe, still considered, if not the biggest mausoleum in America. It's one of the largest ones. But it's important to look at that and there's reasons why the American people in the late 19th century would build such a memorial to this man. And so the answer to Groucho Marx's question, by the way, who's buried in Grant's tomb? Anybody know? No? Nobody knows who's buried in Grant's tomb? No one is buried in Grant's tomb. Grant is entombed in a sarcophagi with his wife, Julia, but they are above ground, so no one is buried in Grant's tomb. But great question. Any other questions? All right, we have the books here. The Grant book and the Truman book, Israel book, are $20, and I have a teaching book there, which is $10. And anyone who's interested, feel free. If you can't do it today, you can also find these wherever books are sold.
Copy for the camera.
All right, so for the camera, this is Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. And this is the book that was nominated for the Truman Award by the Truman Presidential Library. I Am Cyrus, Harry S. Truman, and the Rebirth of Israel. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Really appreciate it. It's very insightful information. Certainly things that I didn't know about Ulysses S. Grant. Couple of announcements. I know Sue wanted to come up and give an announcement.
Normally I would stand at the table, but I'm cognizant that we have people at home either on Facebook or Zoom. I wanted to shout out to Brent. I saw Brent Nielsen was on Zoom, so hi, Brent. But the plug is for what we call District Training Assembly. Janet had to tuck out because her office assistant just had twins. And she's holding down the fort. But this is for Janet's upcoming board members and leadership team. And because of the pandemic still, we couldn't find a place to accommodate. So it is by Zoom, which means it's very convenient. So it opens up at 8:30 Saturday. The registration is through Friday, and it's District Training Assembly. So if you are an upcoming committee chair for Janet or an upcoming officer, there's training specific to your position. Or if you're just trying to tag team and help someone out who works on that committee. So like for foundation, there's a segment on the polio. So I know like Tom's working on polio for the club. I think it's $5 to help defray some of the Zoom licensing that they have. But other than that, that is the next big thing coming up in the Rotary training. So there we go. They were a little slow on it because they were trying to get it out. So if you're, what we've been doing is like, I'm going back to today, I'm the upcoming district public image chair. So I'm getting ready to send a blast out, but they've had it out on DACDB and out on the Facebook page. So it's there, but you didn't see it evidently. So it's okay.
They sent it out a lot.
Right. 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 Well, it wouldn't hurt. Like they say, you know, membership, like Crystal is their upcoming membership chair. They have a lot on membership, but everyone in the club should be focusing on membership. And it would be helpful because there's so many moving parts to membership. So there's an hour breakout on membership. There's an hour breakout on public image and public relations, which is website, Facebook, social media, branding, all of that. And then the afternoon sessions hit all the other various moving parts of Rotary, all the youth programs and things like that in little segments. So. Yeah, if you go to the calendar and then go and look down on the April 24th, you're going to see it's called DTA, District Training Assembly, and you register for it. And there you go. Yes. Saturday. Like I said, Zoom room opens at 8:30. We'll ring the bell at 9, as they say. And we're hoping to wrap it up by 1:30ish. We are going to be recording this for anyone who can't attend them live. Yes. And of course, I'm doing the public image one. So anyone who wants public image, I'll have that. All right. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. The only other announcement, we are having an art show committee meeting this afternoon. So I know many of the members here are present, but anybody at home watching today, we'll be meeting tonight at 5 o'clock at Big Ugly's to go over some last minute details with the art festival. Yes, as I sent out last Friday, emails, beer cup sponsorships, still outgoing. I know a couple of people have responded to that. So anyway, next week, our guest speaker will be Ruth Birch, a master gardener, helping us, I believe, with butterflies, I believe. Is that right, Candy? All right. So helping us attract butterflies to our garden, our property. So, all right. If there's nothing else for the good of Rotary, then we are adjourned. But she is still an average reader. So I would say that. You only have one.
And
I paused it.
did you go to the Facebook thing? Oh, we just need to end meeting.
I was looking for that, I'm not seeing it.
Oh, you're on Facebook. Oh, we gotta go to the meeting.